Hello everyone, welcome to Shockboo Horror Stories. Before we dive into the tales of terror, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and hit that like button. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Your comments will significantly help my channel's growth, and I appreciate your support more than you know. Alright, let's dive into the stories. My grandfather, Thomas Brennan, was a man of faith. As a teenager, he enlisted with the army and found himself in the trenches of France during the First World War, fighting hand-to-hand against enemy soldiers in a landscape he'd never imagined existed. He left home as a boy but came back changed, hardened by what he'd witnessed. After returning, he joined law enforcement in Madison County, deep in the North Carolina mountains, where he served for over 3 decades. Grandpa Tom used to say he'd seen humanity at its absolute worst during the war, witnessed depravity in the mud and chaos of battle. He told me once that evil wasn't just an abstract concept, but something real, something you could almost see taking root in men's souls. He believed every person carried seeds of both good and evil within them, planted there by forces beyond our control. But he also believed we had a choice. We could nurture the good or feed the darkness. That's why he attended church faithfully, trying to cultivate goodness in his heart and make sense of the cruelty he'd seen people inflict on one another. Sometimes he'd stay for the regular service and head home. Other times he'd remain for hours, sitting alone in those wooden pews with his eyes shut tight and hands folded, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. I remember staying at his place one weekend when I was about 14 or 15. My parents were going through a rough patch. Grandpa Tom had been sharing stories from his law enforcement days, some funny, some heartbreaking. That's when I asked him about the strangest or most disturbing cases he'd worked. Being family, I suppose he didn't see any reason to sugarcoat things. What he told me next left me absolutely stunned. It was late October 1924. Grandpa Tom went to sleep that Sunday evening feeling content. The week had been peaceful, the autumn weather pleasant, and his new bride had prepared a magnificent Sunday supper. As he drifted off, everything seemed right with the world. But when he woke the next morning, he found himself in the midst of a nightmare. Grandpa rose at dawn, cleaned up, ate breakfast, and drove his department-issued Ford to the sheriff's office in town, arriving promptly at 7. He'd just settled behind the front desk with his second cup of coffee when a disheveled man stumbled through the door. The man had walked miles along the highway in just his socks. Grandpa could tell immediately the man was intoxicated, his eyes bloodshot and wild, filled with a terror that went beyond simple drunkenness. The stranger lurched to the desk and begged to be locked up. When asked why, he became frantic, insisting he needed to be imprisoned or shot because he'd just killed his wife and baby girl. My grandfather didn't recognize this man, and drunk people say all sorts of nonsense. But something about his demeanor suggested he was telling the truth. So without handcuffs or even locking the main door, Grandpa Tom led him to a cell and immediately called the sheriff to report what he'd heard. Hours later, Grandpa joined the sheriff and several deputies on the drive out to verify the man's confession. Despite being extremely intoxicated when he'd turned himself in, the man hadn't lied. He'd butchered his wife and infant daughter with a hatchet while they slept together. The weapon lay nearby on the floor. Grandpa said the scene was so horrific you couldn't distinguish where the mother ended and the child began. Back at the station, after the man had sobered up somewhat, they asked him why he'd done it. Hungover and exhausted from being awake over 24 hours, he wasn't entirely coherent. But what he said captured my grandfather's complete attention. About 2 months before the murders, the man, whose name was Leonard Mills, was walking home from his job at the lumber mill when he encountered a woman by the roadside. She introduced herself as Rose, and Leonard thought she was the most stunning woman he'd ever laid eyes on. That first day, they simply exchanged smiles as they passed. But the next day, they spoke. And the day after that. And the day after that. By week's end, Leonard couldn't stop thinking about Rose. He counted the hours until Monday when he could see her again on his walk home. This continued for nearly 2 months, with Rose seeming to understand Leonard better than he understood himself. She said things that made him feel invincible, made him believe everything would work out perfectly, that only the two of them mattered in the entire world. Leonard realized early on that he'd fallen in love with her. But as the weeks passed, his infatuation grew more intense, consuming him whether she was present or not. He tried to control himself, knowing it was wrong, but one day, it burst out of him like a dam breaking. He confessed his love, told her he wanted to spend his life with her. But Rose knew Leonard was married, She told him what he wanted was impossible. Abandoning his wife and infant would condemn them to starvation or the poorhouse, institutions. Plagued with disease and death back then. No place for a woman and baby alone. If Leonard and Rose were going to be together, Rose insisted he needed to do something first. Send his wife and infant daughter to heaven. She asked if they were pure and free of sin. When Leonard confirmed they were, Rose suggested there'd be no greater gift than granting them eternal paradise. She convinced him this would ultimately benefit everyone involved, especially his wife and baby, who would forgive him once they understood. And they would understand, because eventually everyone would understand. He described it as being intoxicated without drinking. Rose had twisted his thinking until something utterly wrong seemed not just reasonable but brilliant. So that night, after arranging to meet Rose at a specific location, Leonard retrieved the hatchet from behind his house, waited until they were asleep, and murdered them both. Afterward, he cleaned himself up, changed clothes, and ran into the woods to meet Rose at their agreed-upon spot. He raced through the trees, thinking about his future happiness, trying to push the horrible images further from his mind. But when he arrived at their meeting place exactly on time, Rose was nowhere to be found. Leonard didn't leave immediately. He waited 1 hour, then 2, calling her name and searching the area. But as dawn approached, he spotted something. A small wooden figure, no larger than a child's toy, sitting in the center of their meeting place. When he picked it up and realized it resembled Rose, the truth hit him. He'd been completely deceived. He didn't want to accept it at first. Who would? But as he walked back toward what had been his home, reality crashed down on him. He sat at his kitchen table, drank every drop of illegal liquor he had hidden away. This was during Prohibition, then walked all the way to town to confess. After his confession, the sheriff officially placed Leonard under arrest, which confused him since he thought he already was. He then slept for nearly 24 hours, though his rest was constantly interrupted by nightmares. Every few hours, Leonard would wake screaming, then cry himself back to sleep, apologizing to a wife and daughter who could no longer hear him. It was an unspeakable crime, but Leonard wasn't the only one to commit such an atrocity around that time. Just past noon, another deputy burst into the office reporting a triple murder in a nearby town. A neighbor had gone to check on the Caldwell family, William, his wife, and their 2 young sons, because nobody had seen them all morning, and the boys hadn't shown up at school. She entered the house and discovered a scene from hell. Around the kitchen table lay the mutilated bodies of William Caldwell's wife and 2 sons, all shot multiple times. Deputies visited William's workplace and learned he hadn't reported for work. They searched the surrounding area, including a place locals called Whiskey Creek, where they found him. Caldwell's body was discolored, his eyes open and bloodshot, dried vomit staining his shirt. One hand still gripped the moonshine jug he'd emptied, and in the other hand was a small wooden figure, identical to the one Leonard Mills had found. The sheriff and his deputies were already stretched thin. They had officers watching the Mills house, and others at the Caldwell house. Everyone knew they faced a brutal week of investigations, but they didn't yet know about 2 more bodies waiting to be discovered. A fisherman near the lake was walking along the shore when he noticed something floating near the water's edge. As he got closer, he realized with horror it was a body, later identified as Alan Morgan, a local young man. Within an hour, 2 deputies were guarding the scene while investigators tried to determine what happened. The prevailing theory was that Alan had fallen from the nearby bridge while drunk or exhausted. There was always the possibility he'd been pushed. One deputy climbed onto the bridge to search for evidence of a struggle. He found something, but not what he expected. Sitting on one of the thick wooden railings was another small wooden figure, just like the ones connected to Mills and Caldwell. Over the following weeks, the Madison County Sheriff's Department worked tirelessly to understand these connected murders. Alan wasn't married, so if the wooden figure's presence meant he'd also killed someone, investigators wondered who the victim might be. Searching his residence provided a grim answer. Alan's sister, Catherine Morgan, was found in his bed. He'd killed her, gutted her, and was in the process of skinning her corpse before he apparently stopped and walked to the lake. Whatever happened on that bridge resulted in Alan falling to his death. Deputies investigated these cases for months with barely any rest, finally concluding there was nothing more they could do. Leonard Mills cooperated fully, telling them everything about Rose, until he realized he actually knew almost nothing about her. Despite months of nearly daily conversations, he didn't know where she was from, her family name, or where she'd been living. Deputies went door to door throughout the entire county, asking if anyone knew a woman matching Rose's description: red hair and piercing green eyes. The sheriff expected quick results, but he was wrong. The only person in all of Madison County who seemed aware of Rose's existence was Leonard Mills, the only living person anyway. The idea that this mysterious Rose had manipulated 3 different men into murdering their families seemed impossible. But considering all 3 crimes occurred the same night, and each man encountered one of those strange wooden figures, they were clearly connected somehow. Grandpa Tom said the sheriff theorized it must have been multiple women working together in some elaborate scheme. But that raised the question: what was the scheme? Nothing had been stolen from any crime scene. Leonard Mills said Rose never asked him for money, not even once. These women, if it was multiple women, seemed interested only in convincing Morgan, Caldwell, and Mills to murder their loved ones. After that, they vanished, leaving only those wooden figures behind. Naturally, law enforcement wanted to find the mysterious Rose, but the judge didn't care who she was. Leonard Mills had sworn on the Bible that he alone had murdered his wife and infant daughter. Therefore, the judge decided he alone would face execution. Mills's attorney, his family, even the sheriff believed he qualified for an insanity defense. But since Mills never sought anything but to confess, the judge had no choice but to impose the only appropriate punishment: death. Mills didn't object. He wanted to die. After years on death row, he got his wish. Nobody at the Madison County Sheriff's Department ever found anyone named Rose living in the area, nor anyone matching her description. It naturally became something of a legend among law enforcement, past and present. Then one day, Grandpa Tom visited a retired sheriff who'd served when Grandpa was young. He recounted the entire story of the 3 family murders from October 1924, much as I'm doing now. While telling it, Grandpa reached into his pocket and pulled out one of those wooden figures. Since the other 2 were locked in evidence, he figured borrowing one wouldn't hurt, especially wrapped in cloth, so he wouldn't contaminate it with fingerprints. When he handed the figure to the old sheriff and the man unwrapped it, he studied it briefly before his face went pale. Grandpa said the old sheriff looked up at him with an ashen expression and asked him to repeat the names of the men who'd murdered their families. Grandpa listed all 3 names. The old man then asked if Grandpa knew Mills's mother's maiden name. Grandpa had spoken with members of her family after the murders, but couldn't recall the family name. That's when the old sheriff asked, "Was it Crawford?" Grandpa nodded. It had been Crawford. When he asked how the old sheriff knew that, this is what he learned. When the old sheriff was just starting as a deputy back in the 1890s, he'd helped investigate the murder of an unmarried woman who lived in isolation. The woman, no older than 40, had been in town selling flowers she'd picked. After earning enough money, she bought a bottle of whiskey from the general store and drank it while walking home. The next morning, someone found her near the path to her home. She'd been stripped, violated, and shot through the eye. As a deputy, the old sheriff was assigned to go door to door seeking witnesses. After nearly 3 days with no luck, he finally found someone who'd seen something the evening of the murder. 3 local men, all in their 20s and 30s, had been spotted talking to the intoxicated woman as she left town. The witness could name 2 of them. The third was identified through association. All 3 were brought in for questioning, and for a while it looked like each would be convicted and hanged. But through some legal technicality, none of them spent even a single night in jail for what everyone believed they'd done. It was a terrible miscarriage of justice, so severe that each of the accused had to relocate their families out of town for fear of retaliation. The sheriff turned to my Grandpa Tom and asked if he could guess the family names of those accused men. Grandpa said he didn't need a second guess. When he said Caldwell, Morgan, and Crawford, the old sheriff simply nodded. Those men had moved their families away fearing retaliation. But when vengeance came, it wasn't visited upon them. It was visited upon their grandsons. Grandpa then asked what about the wooden figure had triggered that memory, because the change in the old sheriff's expression had made it obvious. The old sheriff held up the figure and pointed to something. Grandpa and his fellow deputies had always wondered about. One eye was large and round, the other a small, roughly carved pit. Grandpa had always suspected the figures carried some message, but he'd never deciphered it. After that visit to the old sheriff, the message became crystal clear. The figures represented the murdered woman, and this was her revenge. Following that revelation, everyone at the Madison County Sheriff's Department concluded Rose must have been one of the woman's distant relatives, perhaps the granddaughter, of a sibling she rarely saw, someone nobody knew about. No one had claimed her body, and the only mourners at her funeral were townspeople who'd heard her story. But that didn't mean she had no family who eventually learned of her murder, and the injustice that followed, then decided to take revenge in the only way they could. This next tale comes from before the Civil War, straight from the mountains of Highland County, Virginia. Though I've heard it countless times, it never fails to captivate me. It's a story about pride and wickedness, about beauty and goodness, and about how sometimes divine intervention occurs when evil goes too far. So, settle in. Because this is the tale of Daniel, the plantation owner's son, and Sarah May, the prettiest girl in all of Highland County. Highland County sits deep in central Appalachia, where morning sun paints the hillsides golden and the moon hangs low over the valleys at night. People lived simply back then, working their land, tending livestock, and supporting each other through hardships. But even in good times, a shadow loomed over them. The great plantation perched high on the ridge like a monarch surveying subjects, with its vast fields worked by enslaved people. Down in the valley lived humble folk, including Sarah May's family. She was so beautiful she could silence a room simply by entering it. The plantation owner had a son named Daniel, a tall, handsome young man with dark hair and a charming smile that might deceive you if you didn't look carefully. But his heart was cold as winter ice. Growing up privileged with fine possessions and horses, Daniel had never been denied anything without throwing tantrums. As a child, he'd terrorize other children, stealing their belongings just to watch them cry. As he matured, his behavior worsened. He'd take things from the market, knowing his father would cover for him, while people whispered about the terrible things he'd done to enslaved people on the plantation. Things too awful to speak plainly. Then there was Sarah May. She was stunning. Hair like spun gold flowing down her back, eyes bluer than the sky after rain. But it wasn't just her appearance that made people love her. It was her enormous heart. Sarah May was always helping where needed. Her voice was sweet as birdsong, and she'd hum hymns while working, making everything feel right with the world. She'd bring bread baskets to the hungry, mend torn clothing for the poor, and sit beside the sick until they recovered. Her family lived in a small cabin near a meadow, and that's where this tale takes a dark turn. One day, Daniel decided he wanted Sarah May for himself. He dressed in his finest clothes, rode his black horse down to her cabin, and found her on the porch mending a quilt. He tipped his hat with that sly grin, wished her good morning, and told her she was the prettiest girl in the entire county before asking for her hand in marriage. Sarah May looked up from her stitching and said she hadn't realized he felt that way. Daniel confirmed it, adding that any girl for miles would kill to be in her position, and accepting would guarantee her a life of luxury in that big plantation house. But Sarah May wasn't swayed by fancy words or promises. She set down her quilt and met his eyes directly, telling him that while she was flattered, she didn't love him and couldn't marry a man she didn't love. Daniel's face turned red with anger. He reminded her he was the son of the wealthiest man in Highland County, and that she was rejecting a life most would beg for. Sarah May acknowledged that might be true, but she still couldn't marry without genuine love. That was the last straw. Daniel erupted in fury, shouting that she'd regret refusing him, then stormed off, leaving nothing but anger and scattered chickens behind. Daniel wasn't the type to let an insult go unanswered. He brooded in that big plantation house, his rage festering like an infected wound. Over the following days, he conceived a plan darker than coal. He knew Sarah May loved picking wildflowers in the meadows near her cabin, a peaceful spot surrounded by trees with flowers of every color. She went there almost daily, baskets swinging as she sang to herself, and that's where Daniel decided to ambush her. He planned to attack her, take what he wanted by force, then silence her permanently. To cover his tracks, he'd leave some cotton fibers on her body, directing blame toward one of his father's enslaved workers. It was a devil's scheme born of pure spite and poisonous pride, and Daniel intended to follow through. One sunny morning, Sarah May set out for the meadow with her empty basket, ready to gather flowers. Unknown to her, Daniel was watching from the ridge, his heart filled with hatred. Once she was out of sight, he slipped down quietly, following her toward the meadows. The weather looked favorable that morning, so the meadows must have been picturesque. Bees buzzing, birds singing, Sarah May's voice floating on the breeze. I imagine her wandering among the blooms, picking daisies and wildflowers with gentle hands before placing them in her basket. But there was Daniel, crouched low, watching from the tree line, waiting for the right moment to strike. Just as he prepared to spring forward, the sky turned gray. From seemingly nowhere, a dark cloud passed overhead, and distant thunder rumbled through the valley. It was a flash thunderstorm, the kind that sweeps in fast and fierce. Wind whipped through the grass as lightning split the sky. When thunder boomed, shaking the ground, Sarah May looked up with concern. She knew these storms, how they could drench you completely if you didn't seek shelter quickly. Quick as lightning herself, she gathered her flowers and ran for home while Daniel cursed under his breath. He'd waited patiently, and now the storm was ruining his chance. He vowed to try again another day, but fate had different plans. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving cool air and wet ground behind. A traveling merchant was trudging along the road near the meadow when he spotted something odd lying by the roadside. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree or perhaps a dead animal. But as he approached, his stomach turned. It was Daniel, or what remained of him. His body was blackened and twisted, his clothes burned completely off, and the stench of charred flesh hung so heavy in the air it would turn the strongest stomach. Lightning had struck him dead. The merchant crossed himself, muttered a prayer, then hurried to the nearest farm to spread the word. News traveled through the county faster than wildfire. People gathered in town, buzzing about Daniel's death. Some said they'd always known he'd meet a bad end, that he was rotten to his core. Others suggested it was a guardian angel protecting Sarah May, as word of Daniel's marriage proposal had spread through town. Sarah May herself remained quiet. Some said there was relief in her eyes, but also a touch of sorrow. She'd been spared, but it was a heavy burden for a soul like hers to carry. Before long, life returned to its normal rhythm, but the tale of Daniel and Sarah May grew roots. People would tell it around fires, pass it down like an heirloom, and use it to encourage good behavior in their children. "Remember Daniel," they'd say, "who thought he could take what he wanted, but the Lord sent a lightning bolt to set things right." Sarah May lived a long, happy life, marrying a good man who truly loved her. She had sons who carried their father's strength and her kindness. She moved forward but never forgot that day in the meadow. Some say she believed until her last breath that a higher power had intervened to save her. So there's your story, straight from those ancient hills of Appalachia. Pride and cruelty lead to ruin, but goodness and faith will see you through. The Lord watches over us, and sometimes His justice strikes as swift as lightning. On January 19, 1971, two college freshmen from Marshall University decided to hitchhike back to their dormitory after watching a movie in downtown Huntington, West Virginia. During the film's intermission, Jennifer Watson and Susan Cole ran into two fellow Marshall students, Barbara Hayes and her boyfriend Marcus Freeman. The group chatted in the theater lobby while buying refreshments, then sat together for the movie's second half. After the film ended, all four students walked toward Jefferson Avenue. But when a tan-colored sedan drove past them, either Jennifer or Susan stuck out her thumb. The sedan stopped. Barbara and Marcus watched as both girls climbed into the vehicle's front bench seat. They expected to see them back at the campus dorms, but neither Jennifer nor Susan would ever be seen alive again. Barbara Hayes might have been a college freshman, but she wasn't naive. She understood hitchhiking carried inherent risks. So when she returned to the Marshall dorms and discovered neither Jennifer nor Susan were anywhere to be found, she grew concerned. She asked around the dorms, checked their rooms multiple times, and after another hour passed, she contacted law enforcement to report them missing. Barbara was convinced something was wrong, but the officers at the Huntington Police Department didn't share her sense of urgency. The girls had only been gone a few hours, and while Barbara's concern was touching, it was perhaps premature. The officers knew college students, especially those near the Appalachian wilderness, were prone to spontaneous adventures. In all likelihood, Jennifer and Susan would return within a day or two, but they were tragically wrong. After several days passed with no sign of the girls at their Marshall dormitory, Barbara called police again. Only then did they act on her report. Officers contacted the girls' roommates and parents to gather information before issuing a public appeal regarding their whereabouts. Photographs of both girls were released along with details of their last known sighting, but frustratingly, nobody came forward. 6 long weeks passed before the first break in the case, but when it came, it didn't bode well for the missing girls' safety. A teenager participating in a highway cleanup program found Jennifer's handbag among the roadside vegetation. A few weeks later, on April 10, 1971, the West Virginia State Police received an anonymous letter postmarked in Clarksburg, West Virginia, just 3 days prior. It read, "Gentlemen, I have information regarding the location of the bodies of the two missing Marshall University students, Jennifer Watson and Susan Cole. Follow these directions precisely, and you cannot fail to find them. Proceed 28 miles directly south from Huntington's southern boundary. This will bring you to a forested area. Enter the forest exactly 1 mile. There are the bodies. 28 plus 1 equals 29 miles total. I will reveal myself when the bodies are located." The letter was signed with only a crudely drawn circle. Days later, while police were still investigating the anonymous letter, they received a second. Many believed it was prompted by publication of the first letter in a local newspaper. Like the initial correspondence, it was postmarked in West Virginia and signed with only a circle. "Gentlemen," it read, "I saw the article in this morning's newspaper concerning my previous letter about the missing students. If you reread my first letter carefully, you will see the directions were specific. Directly south from the city, meaning Huntington's southern limit. Straight south 28 miles, you will reach a forested woodland. Enter 1 mile south, fanning out. You will locate the girls' bodies covered with brush. Look carefully. The animals are now active. Trust this will help with the exact location. Will still identify myself when bodies are located. Sincerely, Circle." Once the public learned of the letter's contents, widespread outcry prompted West Virginia's governor to order a search based on the directions provided. This search yielded items, including Jennifer's sunglasses along with Susan's handbag and driver's license, scattered between 150 and 200 feet off the road. This suggested someone had deliberately hidden them rather than simply tossing them from a car window. Obviously, law enforcement found the letter's mention of bodies extremely discouraging. But just 2 days after the governor's mandated search, their worst fears were confirmed. On April 18th, the bodies of Jennifer Watson and Susan Cole were found 13 miles south of Huntington, not the 29 stated in the letters. Both had been decapitated. The bodies had been placed one on top of the other, the bottom body face up, the top body face down. Both wore the same clothes they'd been wearing when they vanished. They were also covered with flat stones apparently brought from a nearby creek bed. These stones were later described as resembling grave markers. There was also a fallen tree across the bodies, though whether its placement was intentional remained unclear. Due to advanced decomposition, it was impossible to determine if the girls had been assaulted prior to death. However, since their clothing appeared undisturbed, a pack of cigarettes tucked in Jennifer's jeans waistband was still there. This was considered unlikely. Not only were the girls' severed heads missing, but the necklaces each had been wearing at the time of their abduction were also unaccounted for, as were a fur hat and fur gloves one of them had been wearing. In the days that followed, 2 more letters signed only with circles were sent. One to West Virginia State Police, the other addressed to Jennifer Watson's parents. Each provided directions to the location of the girls' severed heads. A third letter dated April 23rd was sent to Huntington Police. The heads can be found from the body location by heading 12 degrees southwest for the first head and approximately 12 degrees southeast for the second. Roughly 1 mile. You are already 3/4 of that mile. They are within the mine entrance, if you can call it an entrance given its condition. They are buried no more than 1 foot deep. Those responsible scattered some of the girls' personal effects throughout the area, creating confusion, making it difficult to pinpoint any exact location. My first 2 letters triggered your intensive search. Don't give up now. Sincerely, Circle. A final letter dated April 30th was sent to Jennifer's parents. I have sent 3 letters to the West Virginia State Police concerning your daughter, Jennifer. The first and second were taken seriously, and led to a search that successfully located 2 bodies minus the heads, which were needed for other purposes. Suddenly, the police are complaining about an error in my stated mileage. After driving in irregular patterns for 29 miles under January, weather conditions and the involved circumstances, it is impossible to avoid approximately a 16-mile error in the precise location. Nevertheless, they were found south of Huntington as stated, even along what was called a logging lane or old mine road. In my opinion, both the same. Police believe the circle letters' author was their primary suspect in the murders, and early investigation stages centered on this theory. However, following analysis of one letter, police traced them back to 3 members of a small, religious group called the Spiritual Insight Society. When they confronted the group's leader, Reverend Harold Mitchell, he claimed the ability to communicate with spirits from another realm, and that information in the letters had been provided by these spirits. Officers were stunned. Not only were the letters a distasteful hoax, but the author offered no apologies whatsoever. After the Spiritual Insight Society was cleared of any involvement in the girls' murders, the investigation slowed considerably. But years later, in 1977, a man named Frank Dawson shocked everyone by confessing to the murders. Dawson had lived in the nearby town of Milton most of his life. He was also a convicted child abuser, and at the time of his confession was serving time in a Pennsylvania prison for related offenses. When he first contacted West Virginia State Police, he claimed to be having nightmares based on his memories of the murders. Following a lengthy interview, he wrote a 40-page confession after passing a polygraph test. However, during this polygraph test, Dawson displayed complete ignorance regarding intimate case details. In his confession, he made numerous incorrect statements, such as claiming he'd laid the bodies side by side, or that he'd forced them into the back seat rather than the front seat, as confirmed by Barbara Hayes. Weston would later be convicted of kidnapping and draining the blood of a 21-year-old woman named Patricia Murphy, who would have died from blood loss within hours if she hadn't managed to escape Weston's grasp. To this day, no concrete evidence places Weston in Huntington on the date of the murders, but he had reason to be there, a deeply disturbing one. Some have alleged that in early 1971, Thomas Weston was conducting a romantic relationship with his own sister. Since that relationship had to be kept secret, neither Weston nor his sister would announce or admit a visit had occurred. But if one had, and Weston's sister decided to end their unnatural affair, is it possible that a scorned and furious young psychopath would redirect his rage toward two helpless hitchhikers? Another suspect in what became known as the Marshall Co-ed murders was a man named Raymond Turner. Turner had worked as a maintenance worker at Marshall's Henderson Hall, the very dorm where Jennifer and Susan had been staying, but he'd quit in early 1971 for undisclosed reasons. In early April, just weeks after the girls were murdered, a woman filed a report with Huntington police regarding a frightening encounter at a service station. She'd been waiting in line when a strange man began offering her a ride. She refused, but was somehow convinced to wait in the man's car until her friends arrived. The man proceeded to make her extremely uncomfortable, especially once he became fixated on her fur coat and hat. He said he liked touching furry things and raised a hand toward her. The woman immediately fled from his car and reported the interaction to police. But since this occurred before the discovery of Jennifer and Susan's bodies, officers couldn't see the connection between the strange man's obsession with fur and the furry items missing from the girls' bodies. Following the girls' disappearance, law enforcement tracked down the man's employer. Not only did they discover his name was Raymond Turner, but Mr. Turner had called in sick on the morning of January 19th, the very same day Jennifer and Susan went missing. Hoping to connect him to the circle letters, officers visited Turner's residence to obtain a handwriting sample. But comparison showed few similarities between Turner's handwriting and that found in the circle letters. This caused them to prematurely dismiss Turner as a suspect. By the time they realized the letters had been written by the Spiritual Insight Society, the number of potential suspects had grown so vast that Turner was never revisited. Around the same time Turner was being reconsidered as a suspect, police again appealed to the public for information. Shortly after, they received a call regarding a man named Vincent Bird, a Huntington resident with a reputation for starting fires and harming animals. There was another significant problem with Dawson's confession. He claimed to have assaulted both girls multiple times each, yet it was discovered Dawson suffered from a severe medical condition resulting in complete physical dysfunction. Medical professionals stated his condition was so severe that what he described would be physically impossible. Yet just when Dawson's claims seemed worthless, one of his assertions actually advanced the investigation. When asked where he'd disposed of the severed heads, Dawson claimed he'd thrown them into a crevice at an old schoolyard. Police conducted a thorough search, discovering Dawson was again fabricating information. However, after analyzing a bird's nest in the area, police found human hairs visually matching those of Susan and Jennifer. These hairs had no roots attached, leading investigators to believe they'd been cut, not pulled from the victims' heads. Someone hadn't just severed the girls' heads, they'd cut their hair as well. Dawson was officially charged with the murders of Jennifer Watson and Susan Cole, but by his trial date, he'd completely reversed his confession. Since he'd passed a polygraph, it's clear that at some point, Dawson genuinely believed in his own guilt. Following his conviction, he launched a successful appeal claiming he'd knowingly made false statements during trial. At his 1981 retrial, Dawson claimed he'd issued a false confession to escape charges in Pennsylvania, but he was again found guilty. Dawson continued professing his innocence until his death in 2010. and received some vindication when, in 2007, the West Virginia State Police reopened the investigation. Dawson was never fully exonerated, but if he didn't kill Jennifer and Susan, who did? In December 1971, Robert Hayes was arrested in Pittsburgh for beheading a man named Carl Bennett. Following Bennett's decapitation, Hayes drove his severed head to a rural area and placed it under a flat rock near a creek. Born in 1898, Hayes's family had moved to West Virginia when he was in elementary school, and he briefly worked at a mine, less than 2 miles from where Jennifer and Susan's bodies were found. Between 1922 and 1953, there were multiple unsolved decapitations in areas where Hayes resided. He was eventually arrested and imprisoned for one such beheading in 1953, only to be released 15 years later in 1968. The same year Hayes was released, another unsolved beheading occurred. 2 similar crimes happened the following year, with another in 1970. Notably, once Hayes was imprisoned for Carl Bennett's murder in 1971, the string of mysterious decapitations suddenly stopped. Another name on the police suspect list was Thomas Bradley Weston. Weston's father worked for a company that owned the land where Jennifer and Susan's bodies were found. Not only was Weston on university break in January 1971, but his older sister was enrolled at Marshall. Officers from the local police department decided to pay him a visit. While Bird was initially cooperative, he became hostile when they asked what kind of car he'd been driving in early 1971. The question had exposed a convenient gap in his otherwise perfect recollection. After becoming argumentative, he demanded the officers leave his residence. The 2 men complied, thanking him as they headed toward the door. But on the way out, one officer glanced at a framed photograph hanging on Bird's wall and realized he recognized the person in it. The man in the photograph was Raymond Turner, and Vincent Bird was his nephew. Was Turner directly responsible for Jennifer and Susan's disappearance? Or did his own flesh and blood bring them to him hoping to win his approval? The aforementioned individuals constitute just a fraction of the complete list of suspects, and the sheer number of them made finding the girl's killer much more difficult. Yet according to some, the investigation was further hampered by West Virginia's own government. During April of 1972, a West Virginia state trooper named Gerald P. Richardson claimed his employers at the Department of Public Safety had, and I quote, lied about department activity in reference to the murders of Jennifer and Susan. Trooper Richardson also claimed he could provide documentary evidence proving this, adding that a representative of the state governor was interfering in the case for political reasons. One example he gave was the case of Sergeant Michael D'Angelo, who was transferred to a different regional office after insisting the wrong leads were being followed. Trooper Richardson also claimed that Sergeant D'Angelo had been rapidly advancing. An investigation into the car bombing of a vehicle owned by Cabell County, Prosecutor David Martinez, Jr. Mr. Martinez had been conducting a vigorous campaign against gambling and organized crime in his county when a professionally wired car bomb exploded in his driveway. He underwent surgery to treat severe wounds to his right leg and right arm. Thankfully, he survived his injuries, but his right hand was permanently disabled. Mr. Martinez continued practicing law but declined to run for re-election. Trooper Richardson, on the other hand, was promptly dismissed as a West Virginia state trooper. 7 years later, Trooper Richardson sued the West Virginia Department of Public Safety, claiming his dismissal violated his First Amendment rights. The court heard how Richardson had been charged with insubordination after alleging the department's promotional system was, and I quote, based on who you socialize with, or who you know rather than on merit. Richardson also alleged there was, quote, a system that permits an officer to associate with known criminals and still reach a rank of leadership, and that the department reflected a system that still has not learned that professional police work and politics do not mix. A judge later determined that Trooper Richardson's constitutional rights had indeed been violated, and it's believed he was awarded a substantial settlement as a result. But perhaps the reason the state governor, Howard Alexander Mitchell, reacted so ruthlessly to accusations of corruption is because they were true. In 1991, and following an extensive federal investigation, Mitchell pleaded guilty to 6 felonies, including mail fraud, tax fraud, extortion, and obstruction of justice. Not only had he accepted illegal payments and extorted over $600,000 from the Consolidated Energy Corporation, he'd conspired to derail investigations into his own corruption. This may well have included the car bombing Sergeant D'Angelo had been investigating, and quite possibly the murders of Jennifer Watson and Susan Cole. Mitchell was punished with a $3.5 million fine and sentenced to just under 7 years in prison. He ended up paying less than a quarter of his fine, and he served only 2.5 years before serving out the remaining 5 months of his vastly reduced sentence at his home in Meadowbrook, West Virginia. As a result of his conviction, Mitchell was banned from practicing law in the state. During the final years of his life, he fought vehemently to be reinstated. "I followed the advice that I got, and it was not the right advice," he said, referring to his decision to cheat, lie, and steal from the people he claimed to serve. "Being a lawyer is something I always wanted to be. It's what I was and what I am." Thankfully, Mitchell's attempts were unsuccessful, but any links he might have had to the murders of Jennifer Watson and Susan Cole were never established. Frank Dawson might have died with a conviction hanging over him, but it's quite clear he was not Jennifer and Susan's murderer. Yet whether it was Hayes, Turner, Weston, or Byrd who took their lives seems almost irrelevant at this point. The world will always be full of monsters, people who lure the innocent into deadly traps. But we've already established proven systems by which they can be caught, captured, or even stopped before they strike. The final 4 words of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance read, "and justice for all." Yet when corrupt individuals wear masks of virtue and poison those systems with the slow venom of self-service, there is justice for none. Because there is no fighting the monsters without unless we first vanquish those within.